The doors of the Grand Assembly slam open, and the sound echoes through a chamber built for 1,000 different species. I am already sitting in my chair when the warlord speaker of the Kael'thari Empire rises from his seat, holding a blade that is older than every nation on Earth combined. He points it at me. "Human Ambassador Ethan Miles," he says, his voice amplified by the translation grid so it rolls through the hall like thunder. "The Kael'thari Empire declares war upon your species. Effective this moment." Every delegate in the chamber turns to look at me. The insectoid cluster from the Varan cluster stops clicking. The gas-formed beings from Threll dim their light in what I have learned is their version of holding their breath. Even the crystalline delegate, who has no face to read, leans forward. I reach into my jacket pocket, take out a cigarette, and light it. The smoke curls upward in the recycled air of the assembly, and for a moment, nobody says anything at all. "All right," I say, my voice calm, almost bored. "You want coffee first, or should we just get started?" The warlord speaker's antennae twitch. It is a small movement, but I have spent 6 years learning to read Kael'thari body language, and I know what it means. He expected fear. He expected pleading, or shouting, or the kind of desperate diplomacy that other species offer when faced with an empire that spans 400 star systems and controls a war fleet larger than anything humanity has ever built. Instead, he is looking at a man smoking a cigarette like he just heard the weather forecast. "You do not understand," the warlord speaker says, and now there is an edge in his voice that was not there before. "This is not a threat. This is not a negotiation tactic. We have declared war. Your homeworld will burn." I take a slow drag, let it out, and shrug. "I heard you the first time," I say. "I'm just not sure why you're still standing there." Usually when someone declares war, they leave to go start the war. Unless this is one of those ceremonial things where you expect me to say something back. If that's the case, I'll need a minute, because I genuinely don't have anything prepared. A murmur spreads through the assembly. I catch the eye of the avian delegate from Ilth, a species that has always been polite to humanity, and she tilts her head in a way that I think means confusion, though with Ilth people, it is sometimes hard to tell the difference between confusion and amusement. The warlord speaker lowers his blade slightly, only slightly, but I notice. "Your species has no fleet capable of standing against ours," he says. "You have no ally among the assembly powers. You are, by every measure we have taken, alone." "Sure," I say, "that's probably true. And yet you sit there," he says, his voice rising, smoking, as if this means nothing to you. I look at the cigarette in my hand, then back up at him. "It doesn't mean nothing," I say. "It means I have a very long night ahead of me, a lot of messages to send, and probably a headache by morning. But panicking here, in front of you, in front of everyone in this room, isn't going to change a single fact on the ground, so I figured I'd have a smoke instead." The chamber is silent. Somewhere behind me, I hear my aide, a young woman named Grace Bennett, shifting nervously in her seat. She has been with the embassy for 8 months. This is her first declaration of war. It will not be her last, though she does not know that yet. The warlord speaker studies me for a long moment. I can see him trying to find the trick, the hidden card, the reason a species with such a small fleet would sit calmly through the end of its own peace. He will not find it today. I am not going to give it to him. "This session is adjourned," he finally says, and sheathes his blade with a motion that is meant to look powerful, but comes across, to my eyes, as slightly rushed. "The Kael'thari Empire will contact your government through proper channels." "Looking forward to it," I say, and give him a small nod, the kind you give a neighbor when they tell you they're getting new fencing installed. The assembly begins to empty. Delegates rise from 100 different kinds of seats, built for 100 different kinds of bodies, and file out through doors that open in every direction at once. I remain seated until most of them are gone, finishing my cigarette in peace, watching the Kael'thari honor guard march the warlord speaker out through the tall doors at the far end of the hall. Grace leans over to me once the chamber is nearly empty. "Ethan," she whispers, They just declared war on Earth. I know, I say. You don't seem worried. I put out the cigarette in the small tray built into the arm of my chair, a modification the embassy staff installed for me after the third or fourth time I asked for one. I am worried, I say. I'm worried about a lot of things, but there's a difference between being worried and being useful, and only one of those helps anybody right now. She doesn't look convinced, but she nods anyway, because that is what good aides do when their ambassador tells them something with enough certainty in his voice. We walk out of the assembly together, past delegates who watch me the way you might watch a man walk calmly out of a burning building, unsure if he simply hasn't noticed the fire, or if he knows something about fires that you don't. Outside, the sky above the assembly station is the color of dark honey, lit by the twin suns of the Threll system. Ships from a dozen empires drift past the viewing windows, going about business that has nothing to do with the small, strange, stubborn species from a blue planet on the edge of everything. I take out my communicator and type a short message, 3 words. I send it to a single address, one that very few people in this galaxy know exists. Grace watches me do it. "What did you send?" she asks. "Something that needed sending," I say, and slide the communicator back into my pocket. She wants to ask more. I can see it in the way her mouth opens slightly before she decides against it. She is smart enough to know that some questions are not hers to ask yet, and disciplined enough not to ask them anyway. I made the right choice hiring her. We walk toward the human embassy wing in silence, past windows that show the endless dark of space, dotted with the lights of 1,000 worlds that are not ours, and I think about the message I just sent, and the response that is already, quietly, beginning. The war has been declared. Somewhere far behind us, on a planet the Kael'thari have not yet learned to fear the way they should, people are about to find out that humanity has been ready for this exact moment for longer than any of them realize. I light another cigarette, mostly out of habit, and keep walking. There is a lot of work to do, and none of it involves panic. The War Council of the Kael'thari Empire meets in a chamber built from black stone, deep beneath the surface of their capital world, in a room where every wall carries the carved names of battles won across 4 centuries. Warlord Speaker Threx Vor stands at the head of the table, still holding the same blade he carried into the assembly, and he is not smiling. "He smoked," says a tactician named Orin Kale, one of the youngest officers at the table, still holding rank only because his family has served the Empire for 6 generations. In the middle of the declaration, he simply smoked. "I saw it," Threx Vor says. "I was standing directly in front of him." "What does it mean?" asks another officer, an older woman named Sella Rowe, whose face carries the marks of 3 previous campaigns. "Is it a signal to allies we do not know about?" "The humans have no allies," Orin says. "Our intelligence is certain of this. No treaty, no alliance, no hidden fleet. They stand entirely alone." "Then perhaps," Sella says slowly, "he simply does not understand what we are capable of." Threx Vor shakes his head. He has read every report his intelligence officers have compiled on the human species over the past 3 years, ever since the border disputes began escalating into something closer to open hostility. He has watched recordings of human diplomats in a dozen different crises, and there is a pattern in them that troubles him more than any weapon could. "He understands," Threx Vor says. "That is what concerns me." The room falls quiet. Around the table, a dozen officers who have conquered worlds, who have broken the will of species far stronger than the Kael'thari on paper, sit with a discomfort they cannot quite name. "There is a theory," Orin offers carefully, "among some of the junior analysts, that the human species does not fear conflict the way other species do, that something in their history has made them different." "Explain," Threx Vor says. Orin hesitates, then continues. "Before they ever left their own planet, humans went through long periods of struggle among themselves. Enormous struggles, involving tools capable of ending their entire species. Great numbers were lost in single events, and yet they continued, generation after generation, until finally they set aside their differences and turned their attention outward instead. Not one that is dangerous. Perhaps, Oren says, or perhaps a species that survived that long has learned something about survival that we have not. Threx Vor sets his blade down on the black stone table, the sound sharp in the silence. I do not care about their history, he says. I care about their fleet, and their fleet is small. I care about their technology, and their technology is, by every measurement we possess, behind ours. Whatever this ambassador believes he knows, it changes nothing about the numbers. Then why, Sella asks quietly, did he not seem troubled by the numbers? Nobody answers her. The question hangs in the black stone room like smoke that will not clear. Far above them, in orbit around the Kael'thari homeworld, the first ships of the war fleet begin to gather. Thousands of vessels, built across 100 shipyards, drawn from garrisons along a dozen border systems, forming into the largest military assembly the Empire has organized in 3 generations. It is, by any reasonable measure, an overwhelming force, more than enough to end the ambitions of a species with no allies and a fleet a fraction of its size. Threx Vor watches the formation grow on the display screen, mounted along the chamber wall, ship after ship sliding into position with practiced precision, and he tells himself that the numbers are all that matter. He almost believes it. Meanwhile, on the human embassy station, Grace Bennett sits across from me in my office, a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looks out onto the docking bay where our modest diplomatic shuttle sits parked beside vessels 10 times its size. "You sent a message," she says. "Right after we left the assembly. 3 words." "I did," I say. "Can I ask what it said?" I look at her for a moment. She has earned this much, I think. 8 months of watching alien politics unfold in real time, learning a dozen new customs, memorizing the body language of species that don't even have faces in the way we understand faces. She deserves an answer. "It said they declared war," I tell her. "That's all it needed to say." "That's it? Just, they declared war? That's it?" She frowns, clearly expecting something more dramatic, some hidden code or secret plan buried in those 3 words. "Who did you send it to?" "Joint Earth Command," I say, "a specific channel, one that only opens for exactly this reason." "And what happens now?" I lean back in my chair and look out the window at the shuttle, small and unremarkable, next to the great ships of a dozen empires. Now, I say, a lot of very organized people on Earth start doing things that have been planned for a very long time. This isn't the first time an empire out here has decided humanity looks like an easy target, Grace. It's not even the second or third. Her eyes widen slightly. How many times has this happened? This is the 4th, I say, and I say it the way you might mention that it's going to rain later. A simple fact, nothing more. "The 4th, she repeats. "In how long?" "This century," I say. She is quiet for a long moment, processing that number, turning it over in her mind the way I did the first time someone told it to me, years ago, when I was young enough in this job to still find it surprising. "What happened with the other 3? She finally asks. I don't answer right away. Instead, I stand up, walk to the window, and look out at the ships beyond the glass, vessels built by species who have ruled over dozens of worlds for centuries, who have never once had to imagine losing. They stopped, I say simply. Every single one of them stopped. Stopped their campaigns? Stopped existing as empires built around conquest, I say. That's a different thing than being erased, Grace. Remember that distinction. It matters. She doesn't ask me to explain further. Not yet, though I can see the question sitting behind her eyes, waiting for the right moment. Outside, far beyond our small window, the Kael'thari fleet continues to grow, ship after ship falling into formation, an empire preparing for what it believes will be a swift and total victory. I watch them gather for a long while, my expression unreadable, my hands steady, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a memory surfaces of another fleet, another empire, Another conflict that started with just as much confidence and ended in a way nobody in that empire ever expected. History, I have learned, does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes often enough that a person who pays attention can hear the pattern coming from a long way off. I finish my cigarette, put it out, and turn back to Grace. "Get some sleep," I tell her. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day, and I need you sharp, not tired." She nods, gathers her things, and leaves my office, the door sliding shut behind her with a quiet hiss. I remain there a while longer, alone with the window and the gathering fleet, and the quiet certainty that has carried me through 3 previous conflicts before this one. The Kael'thari believe they understand what they have started. They do not. Not yet. But they will. 3 days after the declaration, a soft chime sounds at the door of my private quarters on the embassy station. It is late, by the station's artificial clock, and I am sitting alone with a cup of coffee that has long gone cold, reading reports that Grace has organized for me from Earth. I set the tablet down and open the door to find Leora, the avian ambassador from Ilth, standing in the corridor, alone, without the usual escort of aides that trails behind most delegates when they leave their own embassy wing. "I hope this is not an intrusion," she says. Her voice, filtered through the translation grid, built into a small device at her throat, carries a softness that most species in the assembly do not associate with diplomacy. "Not at all," I say, and step aside to let her in. "Coffee? I have tea too, if that's easier on your species." "Tea would be welcome," she says, settling into the chair across from mine, folding the long feathers along her arms, in a gesture I have come to recognize as a kind of nervous energy, the Ilth equivalent of crossing your arms. I make her a cup, set it down in front of her, and return to my own seat. "I will be direct," she says, "because I understand humans often prefer that." "We do," I say. "Go ahead. Why are you not afraid?" It is not the first time someone has asked me this question, and it will not be the last, but there is something different in the way Leora asks it. She is not trying to provoke a reaction, or gather intelligence for a rival empire, or test my composure the way the Kael'thari delegates have tried in the days since the declaration. She is simply, genuinely curious, the way a person is curious about something they cannot explain from their own experience. "Can I ask you something first?" I say. "Of course. How long has your species been part of the wider assembly? How long since first contact with another star-faring people?" She considers this. "Nearly 600 years. And in that time, has Ilth ever fought a war? A real one, not a border skirmish, but a full conflict, the kind where you did not know if your species would still exist at the end of it." She is quiet for a moment. "No," she says finally. "We have been fortunate. Our neighbors have mostly been peaceful, or too weak to threaten us, or too strong to bother." "That's the difference," I say. "That's the whole answer, really, if you want the short version." "I would like the longer version," she says, and there is something in her posture, a stillness, a genuine attention, that makes me want to give it to her. So I tell her about Earth, not the polished version we give in formal briefings to trade delegations, not the summary written for cultural exchange programs, but the real history, the one that shaped the people who eventually built the ships that carried us out into the stars. I tell her that for most of our recorded history, humanity was not one people but thousands of separate groups, spread across a single small planet, dividing that planet's limited land and resources among ourselves through means that were not always peaceful. I tell her that in just the last century before we achieved unified spaceflight, humanity endured 2 conflicts so large they touched nearly every corner of the globe at once, conflicts that reshaped borders, ended empires that had stood for centuries, and cost more individual lives than the entire current population of some of the smaller species in this assembly. We did not stop fighting because we became wiser overnight, I tell her. We stopped because we finally understood, all of us, every nation and every people, that the alternative to stopping was the end of everything we had built. It took generations of struggle to reach that understanding. It came at an enormous cost. Leora listens without interrupting, her feathers slowly settling into a calmer position as I speak. So when your empire, or the Varen, or whoever else, threatens my species with the end of everything, I continue, you have to understand that this is not a new fear for us. It is an old one. It is possibly the oldest fear we have, and we have already, as a species, looked directly at it and found a way through, more than once, using nothing but our own will and our own hands. But this is different, Leora says. This is an empire with weapons far beyond anything your people faced in your own history. The weapons are different, I agree. But fear works the same way no matter what shape the danger takes. And once you have stared down the worst version of a thing, smaller versions of that same thing stop having the same hold over you. She is quiet for a while, sipping her tea, processing what I have told her in the careful, deliberate way I have noticed most Ilth process difficult information. There is something else, I say, and I feel myself deciding, in the moment, to trust her with a little more than I usually offer to delegates outside our own embassy. This is not the first empire to look at humanity and decide we were an easy target. Your aide mentioned something of this to one of my staff, Leora admits. I did not want to assume it was true. It's true, I say. The Grelic Dominion tried it, nearly 30 years ago, when we were younger to this assembly, and had far fewer ships than we do now. The Osara Concord tried it after that, convinced our small numbers meant small resolve, and the Thren Combine, more recently, believed our lack of aggressive expansion meant we lacked the will to defend what we already had. And in each case, Leora says slowly, what happened? In each case, I say, the empire in question discovered that a species which spent its entire early history learning to survive against itself does not require a large fleet to be dangerous. It requires patience, adaptability, and a willingness to do whatever the situation actually calls for, rather than what tradition or pride demands. You did not destroy them, Leora says. It is not quite a question. No, I say. We didn't need to. Once an empire realizes that the cost of continuing a war against us will always be higher than the cost of stopping, the war usually stops on its own. We are not interested in erasing anyone. We are interested in being left alone to live our lives, and we are very, very good at making that outcome the most reasonable choice available to whoever is threatening us. Leora sets down her cup and looks at me with an expression I have learned, over years of working alongside her species, to read as something close to respect, mixed with a healthy amount of unease. The Kael'thari do not know this history, she says. No, I agree. They know our fleet numbers and our technology levels, and probably a great deal about our trade agreements and our internal politics, but they do not know what we are, underneath all of that. Most empires never bother to learn it, because on paper, it doesn't look like it should matter. And it does matter. It's the only thing that matters, I say. She rises from her chair a while later, thanks me for the tea, and pauses at the door before leaving. I hope, for everyone's sake, that the Kael'thari learn this lesson quickly, she says, quicker than the others did. So do I say, and mean it. A quiet resolution is always better than a loud one. I would much rather they simply understand the situation than have to be shown it directly. After she leaves, I sit alone in my quarters for a long time, thinking about Colonel Adrian Foss, a man I served alongside during the Thren conflict, who once told me that the hardest part of defending Earth was never the fighting itself. It was waiting for people who had never known real struggle to understand, often too slowly, exactly what kind of struggle they were choosing to begin. I send a message to Grace, asking her to schedule an early briefing the next morning with the Joint Command Liaison currently stationed on the embassy. There are preparations to review, positions to confirm, and a long list of quiet, unglamorous tasks that make the difference between a species that survives a conflict and one that does not. The following morning, the liaison, a steady, unhurried woman named Priya Kapoor, who has spent 15 years coordinating between Earth's Defense Command and its scattered diplomatic postings, joins Grace and me in the embassy's secure briefing room. Command received your message, Priya says, laying out a small data display on the table between us. Preparations are already underway. Fleet elements are moving to pre-positioned staging points along 3 border systems. Nothing dramatic, nothing that will draw attention before it needs to. Good, I say. The Kael'thari fleet is still gathering. My estimate, based on their formation patterns, is that they won't move for at least another 2 weeks. Empires like this prefer overwhelming shows of force before they commit, and building that show takes time. 2 weeks is enough, Priya says. Command has run this scenario before. We know how to use the time. Grace, sitting quietly through most of the exchange, finally speaks up. How many people know about this? About the plan, I mean. About what's actually going to happen when their fleet arrives. Priya glances at me before answering, a silent question about how much to share, and I give her a small nod. Fewer than you'd think, Priya says. Command learned a long time ago that the fewer people who know the specifics before a conflict begins, the smaller the chance of that information leaking to someone who shouldn't have it. Most of the officers involved are trained for exactly this kind of situation, without ever needing to know it's coming until the orders arrive. That seems like a strange way to run things, Grace says. It's the way that's worked 3 times already, I say. We're not in the business of changing what works, simply because it seems unusual to outsiders. Priya smiles slightly at that, the first real expression of warmth I have seen from her since she arrived at the embassy months ago. The Kael'thari have no idea what they've started, she says. No, I agree, glancing out the window toward the distant lights of 100 other embassies, 100 other species, none of whom yet understand what is coming. But they will. Everyone always does, eventually. The only question is how much time and how much unnecessary difficulty it takes them to get there. Priya gathers her data display and rises to leave, promising to return with updated positioning reports within 2 days. Grace lingers a moment longer, watching me as I finish the last of my now thoroughly cold coffee. You really believe this will work, she says. Not just hope, believe. I've seen it work, I say. 3 times. The pattern doesn't change much, Grace. Empires that expand through conquest tend to build their entire identity around the idea that they cannot lose. The moment that idea is seriously challenged, even once, even in a single engagement, something in how they see themselves starts to crack. After that, it's rarely about the fighting anymore. It's about finding a way to stop without admitting they were wrong to start. And we let them find that way. We help them find it, I say. Quietly, without humiliation, without pushing harder than we need to. That's the part most people get wrong when they imagine how this works. It was never about beating the Kael'thari into submission. It's about giving them the fastest, least painful path back to peace, and making sure that path is more attractive than continuing to fight. Grace nods slowly, turning the idea over the way she turns over most new information, carefully and without rushing to conclusions. I think I understand, she says. It's not really about the fleet at all, is it? Not even a little, I say, and finally allow myself a small, tired smile. The fleet is just there in case someone doesn't understand the point right away. She leaves the briefing room, and I remain behind for a while, watching the quiet movement of ships and stations beyond the window, thinking about the 2 weeks ahead, the fleet gathering in Kael'thari space, and the calm, methodical machinery of a species that learned, long before it ever left its own world, exactly what it takes to survive. 14 days after the declaration, the Kael'thari fleet crosses into the border region between their territory and the outer edge of human-controlled space, a stretch of quiet star systems known mostly for mining outposts and small research stations rather than anything resembling a military stronghold. Warlord Speaker Threx Vor stands on the bridge of his flagship, the Undying Radiance, watching the formation stretch out across the display in front of him, thousands of vessels moving in perfect, disciplined order. No resistance detected, reports an officer near the front of the bridge. The system is exactly as intelligence described. Minimal defenses, minimal population. As expected, Threx Vor says. The humans have spread themselves thin across too many systems. They cannot possibly defend all of them equally. He expects a swift advance, a series of quick, symbolic victories that will demonstrate to the entire assembly the futility of resisting Kael'thari power. He expects panic, evacuation, perhaps a token defense force that will be overwhelmed within hours. What he does not expect, as his fleet moves deeper into the system, is silence. Report, he says, when the silence stretches longer than feels natural. Sensors show no human military presence, the officer says, a note of confusion entering her voice. The mining outposts appear to be operating normally. No evacuation, no defensive posture whatsoever. They have simply left the system undefended, says another officer, a note of satisfaction creeping into his tone. Perhaps they truly do lack the will to resist. Threx Vor says nothing, but something about the stillness of the system unsettles him more than a defensive fleet would have. He has fought against dozens of species over the course of his career, and he has learned that the ones who seem to offer no resistance at all are rarely the ones who are actually weak. Proceed to the second system, he orders, cautiously. The fleet advances, and the pattern repeats. Systems that should, by every measure of human territorial holdings, contain some form of defense, show nothing but quiet, ordinary activity, populations going about their business as though no war has been declared at all. It is only when the fleet reaches the third system, a modest shipping hub named Corwin's Reach, that the situation changes. The Kael'thari sensors detect a human fleet, positioned not in the open, dramatic formations the Empire's own military doctrine favors, but scattered, spread thin across dozens of smaller groups, tucked behind asteroid fields and the natural cover of the system's outer debris ring. Finally, says the tactician Oren Kale, standing near Threx Vor on the bridge. A target. Do not celebrate yet, Threx Vor says. Analyze their formation before we commit. The analysis takes longer than expected, and what it reveals troubles the officers reviewing it. The human ships are not arranged for a traditional engagement at all. They are positioned to intercept, to disrupt, to strike at specific vulnerable points in a much larger force, rather than meet that force head-on in open combat. They know our formations, Oren says slowly, studying the pattern, not just our general tactics, our specific formations, down to the positioning of individual ship classes. That should not be possible, Sela Ro says, standing nearby. Our formation patterns are closely guarded, and yet here they are, positioned as though they have studied our battle records for years, Oren says. Threx Vor stares at the display for a long moment, a slow, uncomfortable understanding beginning to form. The human species has spent whatever time it possessed since the border tensions began, not simply preparing defensive numbers, but studying the Kael'thari themselves, learning their habits, their preferred strategies, their weaknesses, with the same patient, methodical attention a scholar might apply to a difficult subject. Engage, he orders finally, unwilling to retreat before an enemy so clearly outnumbered. Standard advance formation. The engagement that follows is unlike anything recorded in Kael'thari military history. The human fleet does not attempt to hold ground or meet the Kael'thari numbers directly. Instead, smaller groups strike quickly at specific points along the Kael'thari formation, disabling communication relays, disrupting coordination between ship groups, and withdrawing before any significant counterforce can be brought to bear. It is not a battle in the traditional sense at all. It is closer to a demonstration, a careful, controlled display of exactly how much disruption a much smaller force can cause when it refuses to follow the rules its opponent expects. Within hours, the Kael'thari fleet's coordination has been thrown into confusion. Ships that should be moving in disciplined formation instead struggle to maintain contact with their command structure. Losses are, by Kael'thari standards, relatively modest, but the humiliation of the disruption cuts far deeper than the material cost. Threx Vor watches the display with a growing, uncomfortable clarity. This was never meant to be a battle they could lose in numbers. It was meant to be a demonstration, delivered with precision, that the Kael'thari's overwhelming force means very little against an opponent who refuses to fight the war the Kael'thari prepared for. "Order a withdrawal to regroup," he says finally, his voice carrying none of the confidence it held 2 weeks earlier in the Grand Assembly. Elsewhere, aboard a modest human command vessel positioned well outside the immediate engagement zone, a woman named General Mara Voss watches the same disruption unfold on her own display, speaking quietly into a secure channel connected to the embassy station. "First contact went exactly as projected," she reports. "Minimal losses on our side. Their coordination has broken down significantly." On the embassy station, I receive her report in my office. Grace standing nearby, watching the numbers scroll across my screen with an expression somewhere between relief and disbelief. "That's it?" she asks. "That's the whole battle?" "That's the first one," I say. "There will likely be more, though I suspect they'll be smaller and further apart as the Kael'thari command structure tries to understand what just happened to them. They don't know what to do," Grace says slowly, reading the confusion evident even in General Voss's clipped, professional report. "No," I agree. "They built an entire military doctrine around overwhelming numbers and disciplined formations because that's what has worked for them against every other species they've encountered. They've never faced an opponent willing to simply refuse the terms of engagement they expect." 2 days later, a second, smaller Kael'thari force attempts a more cautious advance into a neighboring system and encounters the same pattern, human ships appearing exactly where the Kael'thari formation is weakest, disrupting rather than destroying, withdrawing before serious losses can be inflicted on either side. It is not a war fought for territory or for annihilation. It is a war fought entirely to teach a single, unmistakable lesson, delivered as efficiently and with as little unnecessary conflict as possible. By the end of the first week of active engagement, a second Kael'thari delegate, a nervous, younger diplomat named Vesa Thorn, requests an emergency private meeting with me through neutral assembly channels. She arrives at the embassy alone, without the ceremonial escort her superiors typically favor, and sits across from me with an expression I recognize immediately, having seen versions of it 3 times before in 3 different species. "Ambassador Miles," she says carefully, "I have been authorized to speak candidly, off the formal record." "Go ahead," I say. "Our fleet has sustained disruptions we did not anticipate," she says. "Warlord Speaker Threx Vor believes this to be a temporary setback, easily corrected with adjusted tactics." "Does he?" I say, without much interest in the question. "Do you believe otherwise?" she asks. I lean back slightly, studying her, this young diplomat clearly sent to gather information her superiors are unwilling to ask for directly. "I think your warlord speaker is going to spend the next several weeks adjusting tactics that were never really the problem to begin with," I say. "The issue isn't formation, it isn't ship class distribution or communication protocols. The issue is that your empire built its entire military identity around fighting opponents who agree to fight the way you expect them to fight. We don't agree to that. We never have." Vesa Thorn is quiet for a long moment. "What would it take," she asks finally, "for this to end? For your empire to understand something it clearly doesn't understand yet," I say. "That we were never trying to win a war in the way your empire measures winning. We were trying to make continuing this conflict more costly, more confusing, and more pointless than simply agreeing to leave us alone. That message usually takes a little longer to land than people expect, but it lands eventually. It always has." She leaves without further questions, and I watch her shuttle depart from the embassy's docking bay, carrying whatever fragments of understanding she has gathered back to a war council that is, I suspect, only just beginning to grasp the shape of the mistake it has made. That evening, Grace finds me in my office again, the same cold cup of coffee sitting on my desk, the same quiet, patient certainty in my posture that has been there since the moment the declaration was first made. "They're starting to understand," she says. "Some of them," I say. "The younger ones, mostly. The ones who haven't spent their whole careers believing the numbers are all that matter." And the warlord speaker? He'll understand too, I say. Everyone does, eventually. Some people just need a few more disrupted formations before the lesson finally sticks. I light a cigarette, watch the smoke drift toward the recycled air vents above my desk, and think, not for the first time, about how strange it is that the hardest part of ending a war has so little to do with fighting it, and so much to do with simply waiting for the other side to stop believing in a version of victory that was never actually possible to begin with. 3 weeks after the declaration, the Blackstone War Council chamber beneath the Kelthari capital feels different than it did on the first night the Empire's officers gathered there to discuss the strange calm of a single human ambassador. The carved names of 4 centuries of victories still line the walls, but the room itself has grown quiet in a way that has nothing to do with the volume of anyone's voice. Warlord Speaker Threx Vor sits at the head of the table, no longer standing, no longer holding his blade with the confident grip he carried into the Grand Assembly weeks earlier. Around him, the officers who once spoke with certainty about numbers and formations and the inevitability of Kelthari victory now review reports that describe something none of their military doctrine ever prepared them to face. 7 engagements, Sella Rowe reports, her voice flat, professional, carefully stripped of the frustration she must be feeling. In every case, our losses have been modest. In every case, our coordination has broken down before any decisive advantage could be secured. The humans have not attempted to hold a single system. They have not attempted to destroy a single major vessel. Then what? Threx Vor asks. Are they attempting to do? I believe, Oren Kale says carefully, they are attempting to show us that we cannot win. Not through overwhelming force, not through attrition, simply, patiently, showing us, again and again, that the war we prepared for is not the war they intend to fight. Threx Vor is silent for a long moment, staring at the reports laid out before him, at the growing list of disrupted formations and confused engagements that somehow, despite every advantage in numbers and technology his empire possesses, have not moved the conflict a single meaningful step closer to victory. He thinks of the human ambassador, sitting calmly in the Grand Assembly, lighting a cigarette while the warlord speaker of an empire spanning 400 star systems declared war on his people. He thinks of the stillness in that gesture, the complete absence of fear, and he understands now, finally, weeks too late to spare his empire the cost of learning it the hard way, exactly what that stillness meant. Prepare a request, he says quietly, through proper assembly channels. We wish to discuss terms. The room is silent. No one argues. No one suggests continuing the campaign, adjusting the tactics further, committing additional resources to a conflict that has already cost the Empire more in confusion and uncertainty than it has gained in any measurable advantage. The officers who once spoke with total confidence now simply nod, understanding, in the particular quiet way that follows a hard lesson finally learned, that the campaign has already ended, whether or not the formal declaration has caught up to that reality yet. 4 days later, I sit once again in the same chair I occupied in the Grand Assembly on the day the war began, watching the same tall doors open, the same honor guard march through them, though this time Threx Vor walks without his ceremonial blade drawn, and his posture carries none of the confidence it held weeks earlier. The chamber fills the same way it did before, delegates from a dozen species settling into seats built for their particular forms, watching the proceedings with the same careful attention, though the atmosphere in the room has shifted entirely. What was once tense anticipation of a coming conflict has become something closer to quiet curiosity, an entire assembly watching to see how this particular story concludes. Threx Vor stops in the same place he stood when he first declared war, though this time he does not raise his voice, and he does not point anything toward me. Ambassador Miles, he says, and there is a weight in his voice that was absent before, something closer to genuine respect than the performance of authority he carried into our first meeting. The Kelthari Empire wishes to request terms for the cessation of hostilities. I take a slow breath, reach into my jacket, and light a cigarette, the same unhurried motion that unsettled him so completely 3 weeks earlier. This time, though, I can see in his expression that he expected exactly this, that he has spent the walk into this chamber, preparing himself for precisely this response, and there is something almost like relief in his posture when I finally give it to him. "All right," I say, echoing my own words from weeks earlier, though this time the meaning behind them has shifted entirely. "Let's talk terms then." The negotiation that follows is, by the standards of most conflicts recorded in assembly history, remarkably brief. I do not demand territory, or reparations, or the kind of humiliating concessions that might satisfy a desire for vengeance but would do nothing to secure a lasting peace. I ask only for what humanity has asked for from the beginning, in every conflict that came before this one: recognition of our borders, an end to hostile posturing along our territories, and a formal commitment, backed by assembly oversight, that the Kael'thari Empire will not attempt this particular mistake again. Threx Vor agrees to every term with a speed that surprises even the delegates watching from the gallery, and by the end of the session, a formal peace agreement has been drafted, reviewed, and signed by both parties, ending a war that lasted barely 3 weeks and cost neither side anything close to what either originally expected when it began. As the session closes and delegates begin filing out of the chamber, Leora approaches me quietly, her feathers settled in the calm position I now recognize as genuine ease rather than diplomatic performance. "You did exactly as you said you would," she says, quiet, without humiliation. "That was always the plan," I say. "Loud victories tend to plant the seeds of future conflicts. Quiet ones tend to actually end them." "The Kael'thari will remember this," she says. "I suspect for a very long time." "Good," I say. "That's the point." She glances toward the empty space where Threx Vor's honor guard stood only minutes earlier. "This is the 4th Empire you told your aide, the 4th this century." "It is," I say. "May I ask," she says carefully, "what will happen to them now? The Kael'thari, I mean, now that the war has ended this way?" I consider the question for a moment, watching the last of the delegates file out of the Grand Assembly, thinking of the 3 empires that came before this one, each of them humbled in roughly the same quiet, patient way, each of them eventually finding their way to a peace that held far longer than anyone in their own leadership initially expected. "They'll adjust," I say. "Empires that survive this particular lesson usually do. They'll spend a few years wondering how they misjudged us so badly, and then they'll quietly stop being empires built around the assumption that conquest is always available to them. Some remain as they are, just smaller in ambition. Others change more completely. Either way, they stop being a problem. And the ones that don't adjust. I think of a name I have not spoken aloud in years, an empire whose records now exist mostly as a cautionary tale taught in assembly diplomatic academies, a warning about the cost of refusing to learn a lesson the first, or even the second time it is offered. There have only ever been a handful of those, I say, and none of them exist anymore, not in any form that would recognize its former self. That's not a threat, Leora. It's simply what happens when a species refuses to stop making the same mistake, over and over, against an opponent who has already shown them, repeatedly and patiently, exactly where that path leads. She studies me for a long moment, and I can see her turning this over carefully, filing it away alongside everything else she has learned about humanity over the past 3 weeks. The same slow, deliberate processing I first noticed the night she visited my quarters for tea. "I am glad," she finally says, "that my species has never had reason to test that particular lesson." "So am I say, and mean it entirely." She takes her leave, and I remain a while longer in the emptying chamber, watching the last delegates depart, thinking about the long walk back to the embassy station, the reports Grace will already be preparing, and the quiet, unremarkable relief of another conflict resolved without unnecessary cost on either side. Outside the assembly, I find Grace waiting near the entrance, having watched the proceedings from the observation gallery reserved for embassy staff. "It's really over," she says, as we begin walking together toward the human embassy wing. 3 weeks, that's it. "That's usually how long it takes," I say. Give or take. How do you do this? She asks, and there is genuine wonder in her voice now. The last traces of her earlier nervousness finally settling into something closer to understanding. How do you sit there, every single time, and just not be afraid? I think about the question for a long moment, watching the ships drift past the tall windows lining the corridor, vessels from a dozen different species going about their business, unaware or uninterested in the quiet conclusion of a conflict that, to most of the wider galaxy, will barely register as a footnote. I think, eventually, I say, you learn that fear is a tool, Grace, not a master. You feel it when it's useful, when it sharpens your attention or keeps you cautious in the right moments, and you set it aside the rest of the time, because carrying it constantly doesn't make you safer, it just makes you tired. Is that something you learned in this job? Some of it, I say. Most of it, I think, is something my whole species learned a long time ago, long before any of us ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. We already know what the worst version of struggle looks like. We built it ourselves, more than once, and we survived it anyway. Everything since then has just been a smaller version of a lesson we already learned the hard way. Grace is quiet for a while as we walk, absorbing this the way she absorbs most things, carefully, without rushing toward a conclusion. Do you think there will be a fifth one? She finally asks. Another empire, I mean. Another declaration. I light a fresh cigarette, take a slow drag, and consider the question honestly, the way I have learned to consider every serious question in this job. Probably, I say. The galaxy is a big place, Grace, and there will always be someone new who looks at our numbers, sees a species with a modest fleet and no obvious allies, and assumes that means we're an easy target. It happened 4 times already. It will likely happen again. And when it does. I glance back toward the now empty Grand Assembly Chamber, its tall doors closed, its business concluded for the day, and I think of the quiet, patient work still ahead, the terms to formalize, the reports to file, the slow, steady process of turning one more conflict into one more lesson that will, eventually, ripple outward through the wider assembly, one species at a time, one cautious delegate at a time, until the reputation itself becomes the deterrent long before any fleet ever needs to move. When it does, I say, I'll sit in the same chair, listen to the same kind of speech, and probably light another cigarette. Behind us, in the observation gallery of the Grand Assembly, a young delegate from a species neither of us has formally met turns quietly to an aide standing beside her, having just overheard, second-hand, the story already spreading through the station's diplomatic corridors, of a human ambassador who greeted a declaration of war with nothing more than a shrug and a slow, unbothered exhale of smoke. 4 empires, the delegate murmurs, almost to herself, turning the number over with the same careful unease that has followed it through every species that has learned it since the war began. What happened to the first 3? The aide beside her has no answer. Neither, for that matter, does anyone else in the wider galaxy who has not yet had the particular experience of finding out.